Hello ladies and gentlemen of the internet, my name is Messiah, and welcome to the compilation of the Japanese creation story, part 1 through 3. This video is being created to help promote the Japanese mythology part 4 video, which should be coming soon-ish. Maybe. And also because I didn't have any patrons at that time, allow me to thank them now, Pyrotic Napalm and Kitch Fairman. If any of you would also like to help support my channel, link to the Patreon is down in the description down below, as well as to my Discord. Oh, and hey, look at that, Parlor's back up. For now. Go ahead and follow me there as well. Alrighty guys, thank you, and because I didn't think of this at the time, have a God's blessed day. Now, like most creation myths not hampered by historical editing or some other dominant missionary religion, Japan's creation story is a little bit muddy, especially when it comes to its early origins, simply due to the fact that aside from some of the more major stuff, there are multiple different accounts for these stories. Most sources say that in the beginning there was a heaven and the earth, but they were formless and malleable, floating on the surface of the waters like a slab of animal fat. Or as most sources put it, a jellyfish. Takamagahara, or the heavens, served as the breeding grounds for the three primal deities. Ame no Mina Kanushi, the heavenly center lord, Takamimu Subi, the high generative force, and Kami Musubi, the divine generative force. Collectively, these three are known as the Zoka Sanshin, and are referred to as Hitorigami, which are deities born without gender and are produced asexually, without the need for any male or female gods to do the no-pants dance. Though no sources I was able to find were able to point to how exactly the Zoka Sanshin came into being, a possible explanation lies in the alternate accounts which profess that in the beginning, just like with the Chinese, there was a gigantic egg, within which resided all things in a swirling vortex of chaos. Boy, doesn't that sound familiar. And while you may want to chalk all that up to Chinese influence on the Japanese mythos, it's not the only thing the Japanese borrowed from the Chinese, as we'll be discussing later on in this video. Basically what you need to know is that China had a massive influence on the development of Japanese culture, and so I feel that these parts at least deserve a mention in the video. Anyway, getting back to the creation story, the gelatinous blob, which is the earth, sprang reed shoots, which became two more gods. Oh my god. Uma Shia Shikabi Hi Koji, god of energy and, quote, excellent reed shoots. Okay. And Ame no Toko Tachi, the god of heavenly standing. It's important to note that these two incredibly hard to pronounce gods are also Hitorigami, and while they were born after the Zoka Sanshin, none of the references I uncovered said anything about the previous three kami influencing the creation of the latter two, and in fact professed that they were all a part of the same generation of gods known as the Kami Yo Nananyo. Then came the second generation of kami, which consisted of yet another pair of Hitorigami, Kuni Noto Kotachi and Toyoku Mono. Since these gods were finally born with genitals, they could finally get down to business and start producing gods the more typical way. And so the third generation came around, consisting of Unijini and Suhijini, who produced the fourth generation, Sunoguhi and Ikuguhi, who smashed and made the fifth generation, Ohotonoji and Ohotonobi, who likewise produced the sixth, Omodaru and Ayakashi Kone, who then finally birthed the seventh generation of kamis, the one that we actually care about, Izanagi, he who invites, and Izunami, she who invites. The variation of this myth leaning on Chinese influence is far more condensed and doesn't make any mention of the previous 6 generations of kami. In this version, the lighter and heavier halves of the chaos separated, with the dark and edgy side settling to form the earth, while the lighter and purer side became the heavens. These halves were known as In and Yo, respectively, or as they are more commonly referred to, Yin and Yang, another traditionally Chinese concept. And from these two halves there were born two kami by the name of, surprise surprise, Izanagi and Izanami. So the elder kami decided one day that the earth needed some structure and order to it, and so they tasked Izanagi and Izanami to fix this with a fancy jeweled scepter by the name of Ama no Nobuku. However, the elder gods didn't exactly give the two an instruction manual, so they stood on the heavenly bridge for a while and wondered what to do with the waters of In. That's the earth, for those of you not keeping track. However, as they retrieved Ama no Nobuko from the water, a drop spilled off and became the island of Onogoro-jima, which the two gods eagerly descended upon, finally and anticlimactically completing their task. There on the island, Izanagi confessed that as the embodiment of Yo, he felt that he was too full inside, while Izanami stated that as the embodiment of In, she felt completely empty inside. And so Izanagi decided to fill that hole, both literally and figuratively, if you know what I mean, by proposing to Izanami in marriage. Keep in mind that this would be the 6th time that the Japanese gods would produce incest babies, making the family tree look more like a family stump. Evidently, this finally had some consequences for the first time ever in any mythology, as their first child, Ibisu, or as he was later called, Hiroko, comes out a deformed mess without any bones or limbs, and was referred to as a leech child. And so they built a boat and sent him on his merry way. After they tried again with absolutely no luck, Izanami and Izanagi consulted the elder gods as to what exactly went wrong. And according to them, it was because they performed their wedding ceremony incorrectly. You see, Izanami and Izanagi had to walk around the entire earth and then meet one another at the halfway point. In more merciful accounts, it was just a pillar. When they did meet up, however, Izanami spoke first, saying, "What a fine young man." Evidently, this cursed the entire marriage because Izanagi was supposed to speak first because he's the male, and also because ancient Japan was just about as sexist as the rest of the world at the time. However, this isn't nearly as bad as the Chinese-influenced version, where Hiroko is never even born and Izanagi just tells Izanami that she's a stupid bitch and that they need to start all over again. This is probably a good time to mention that things don't ever get any better for poor Izanami, as we'll touch up on later. So as foretold by the elder gods, Izanagi and Izanami did the whole thing over again, this time with Izanagi speaking first, and that seemingly fixed the incest issue. After consummating the marriage, Izanami gave birth to the 8 major islands of Japan: Awaiji, Shikoku, Oki, even though that's a group of islands, Kyushu, Iki, Tsushima, Sado, and most importantly, Honshu, where Tokyo is located. Interesting side note, at the time of the Kojiki's publishing, Hokkaido and the Ryukyu Islands weren't discovered yet. Therefore, they were left out of the creation myth. Izanami was then said to give birth to 6 minor islands before moving on to give birth to the 8th generation of gods. Those of the winds, trees, mountains, rivers, seas, and plains, none of which are significant enough for me to mention, with exception to Kagusuchi, the kami of fire. Now naturally, as the god of fire, Kagusuchi was born a blazing hot baby who literally gave his mother fatal 3rd-degree burns as she was trying to birth him. This caused Izanami to vomit up even more gods, and when Izanagi cried for her death, his stream of tears brought forth another goddess, and then because he's a massive dickhead, when he chopped off his infant son's head for killing his wife, Kagusuchi's blood made up even more gods. And then Izanagi stubbed his toe and made another god, and then he hogged a loogie at the ground and made yet another god, and then he was audited by the IRS, so then he combed his hair and made the god of accounting. I think you get the picture here. There were a shitload of gods created on this day, and I cannot be bothered to name all of them, only the significant ones, which I can promise you we are eventually going to be getting into. So Izanami, unsurprisingly, died a horrible and painful death, and so Izanagi went to Yomi, the Japanese underworld, to try and fetch her. Now, it's important to note that the Japanese underworld is incredibly dark, and so Izanagi was unable to see where he was going down there, so when he did meet up with Izanami, he was unable to see her, but he could still hear her. By the way, this next part sounds like a copy-paste of the Greek myths surrounding Persephone and Orpheus, which I may or may not get into covering in the future. So Izanami tells Izanagi that she can't come home yet because she has already eaten at the hearth of Yomi, and it's kind of a rule that you can't leave once you've eaten there, kind of like a graduation party. Nevertheless, Izanami promises to see what she can do by negotiating with the gods of Yomi, but wants Izanagi to promise her that he wouldn't try to look at her until she was ready to return to the world of the living. Izanagi, having the intelligence and the respect for others of a stray cat constantly meowing at my window at 3 in the morning, no seriously, fucking quit it! Decides to do exactly the opposite and follows her down into the darkness, breaking off a tooth from his comb and then lighting it on fire using it as a torch. Only to see that his wife has been reduced to a rotting, maggot-infested corpse. Izanami, finally having enough of Izanagi's shit, angrily chases after him, with the maggots infesting her body, falling out, and turning into the thunder god Raijin, who is so friggin' cool he deserves a video onto himself. Izanami has Raijin and several other warriors of Yomi, pissed off at the fact that he disturbed the darkness of the underworld, give chase to Izanagi, who tries to diverge their attention by tossing food at them, which works on everyone for the most part except Izanami, who continues to pursue her now ex-husband/brother up until he escapes Yomi and then seals it up with a gigantic rock. Izanami then proclaims her hatred for Izanagi and says that as atonement for his actions, she will kill 1,000 people per day, to which Izanagi countered by creating Barry White music and then saying that he will cause 1,500 babies to be born every day. And from that day forward, Izanami rebranded herself as Yomotsu Okami, or the Goddess of the Dead. Okay, we're done with that joke. Izanagi, satisfied that he finally put his woman in her place, decides to go and take a bath at the island of Tsukiji, where it is said that even more deities are born from him taking his clothes off? This has got to be the lamest creation story for any god ever. It's important to note, however, that once Izanagi gets into bathing, he actually does create some worthwhile gods. By wiping his left eye, he gave birth to the female Hitorigami of the sun, Amaterasu. Then, by wiping his right eye, he created the moon god, Tsukiyomi. And finally, he blows his nose and creates Susano, the kami of the seas, who will also go on to become a massive problem child for the rest of the Japanese pantheon. But that is a story that will be covered in part 2 of this creation story in, say, about a week or two. I don't want to make any promises. So Izanagi just finished washing himself of the filth of Yomi, and from that bath came 3 of the most important Shinto gods: Amaterasu, Susano, and Tsukiyomi, who traditionally is male in the Kojiki, but according to various other media which has been published in the following centuries, depict Tsukiyomi as a female, probably since the moon is traditionally seen as a feminine object rather than a masculine one. And also, because I'm a massive mythology nerd, allow me to also clear up that it is pronounced Tsukiyomi, not Tsukuyomi, as Tsuki in Japanese translates to the moon, whereas Tsuku translates to stick something. And if you go by the traditional translation from the Kojiki, his name is Tsukiyomi no Kami. Not sure why I even bother bringing this up, because Tsukiyomi does absolutely nothing in this story. Well, maybe. So Izanagi left the world at the mercy of these 3 gods, assigning Amaterasu as the goddess of the sun, Tsukiyomi as the god of the moon, and Susano as the god of the storms and seas. Amaterasu and Tsukiyomi took to their new positions kindly. However, their brother Susano decided to be a massive crybaby over his mother, Izanami, who was left trapped in Yomi as its new goddess, Yomotsu. What's interesting about this fact is that Yomotsu really isn't Susano's mother, as he was born solely from Izanagi wiping his nose clean while bathing. meaning that technically he's a Hitorigami, or an asexually produced god. This crime carried on for so long, Susano grew a beard, which was said to be 8 hand lengths long before Izanagi had enough of this, and just told Susano that if he wants to be with his mother so badly, he should just go down to the underworld to be with her, and so he subsequently banishes him from heaven. And then he dies! Well, debatably. It's said that after Izanagi banished Susano, he hid himself away in retirement in Awaiji. Now, what's important to note here is that in Old Japanese, hiding is just an old adage for death. And seeing as he doesn't appear in any of the other Japanese myths from this point forward, it can be assumed that Izanagi just kind of died here of old age or something. However, his spirit continues to live on, making good on his promise to create 1,500 babies in response to Yomotsu killing 1,000 people per day. Anyway, Susano is a big baby and decides to take his leave of his sister, Amaterasu, in the realm of the sky. Now, it's important to note there that from day one, these two never got along. In fact, it's stated in the Nihongi that Amaterasu was so suspicious that Susano may have been coming up to her heavenly realm to conquer it, that she prepared herself for war against her younger brother. In order to earn her trust and try and convince her that he wasn't such a bad guy, Susano proposed a challenge to the now debatably matriarchal goddess. They would both take one another's items and... You've got to be kidding me. Create even more gods. Now, the idea behind this challenge was to prove that Susano was pure of heart by eating something of Amaterasu's, and therefore producing male deities, which I guess only the pure of heart can do. But I'm sure more of you are just curious as to where these gods are supposed to come out. Yikes. So Amaterasu takes Susano's sword, a Totsuka no Tsurugi, which is not a specific sword unto itself, rather a name given to any sword of that specific length in Japan. And Susano takes Amaterasu's necklace, which is unique because it was given to her by Izanagi. And they set to work fashioning yet another set of unremarkable gods, who I, again, will not mention. Amaterasu manages to create 3 female deities by swallowing Susano's sword. Or alternatively, 3 of her own swords, it really doesn't matter. While her brother manages to, fashion 5 male deities out of Amaterasu's necklace. However, in a surprise twisting of the rules, Amaterasu claims that she actually won the contest because her necklace produced more gods than Susano's sword, even though she didn't actually create them. Cheating bitch. Understandably, Susano was upset by this result, and being prone to temper tantrums anyhow, he did some, radical things to get back at his sister. First, he whipped up a storm and broke down his sister's sacred rice paddies. Then he defecated in the Hall of First Fruits. And finally, and most famously, he threw a flayed pony into the weaving hall of Amaterasu, which spooked the sun goddess so much she injured her lady parts on a weaving shuttle and then retreated into Ama-wa-Aito, the heavenly rock cave. That's according to the Kojiki's account, but in the Nihongi, which keep in mind is the later account with more of a Chinese influence, it's said that the shock of the dead horse being thrown into the weaving hall caused Amaterasu's weaving partner to fall off from the loom, injuring herself with the shuttle, and that killed her. In some translations, all of her weaving partners die in this manner. Either way, Amaterasu then sealed herself inside with a massive stone at the mouth of the cave, effectively leaving the world in perpetual darkness, because without her, the sun would not rise in the morning. This was a problem for a number of reasons, because without the sun, nothing can grow and the earth turned cold. And because it was dark, I guess, the evil spirits were allowed to run rampant throughout the land. A problem of this magnitude was going to require some trickery on the god's part, and so, in an attempt to lure out the sun goddess, they had a group of roosters crow at a false dawn. But seeing as this really wasn't the issue, and it was more about, dead ponies, she refused to come out. And so the land remained in darkness until Amohi Kane, the wise god of... thought combining? Came up with a plan. Seeing as Amaterasu was a goddess of the sun, she obviously gave off a bright, radiant glow which could be used against her in order to lead her out of the heavenly rock cave. And so, he persuaded the goddess of the dawn, Ama no Ozumi, to perform a striptease on an upturned sake tub for the rest of the gods, so the bunch of perverts would create a whole lot of hooting and hollering, which ideally would lead Amaterasu out from the cave, where Amohikane and Taiji Kawawo, the hand strength male deity, would be waiting for her. And so the plan proceeded as laid out, with Uzumi doing her part brilliantly, though some sources state that she was possessed when she was exposing her naughty bits, so it may not have been as voluntary as some claim it to be. Regardless, the gods were creating quite a bit of noise, and this caught the curiosity of Amaterasu, who opened up the cave just a little bit, but not wide enough for a dead horse to fit through, and asked what all the hubbub was about. To which Uzumi replied, "We are celebrating because there is a goddess who shines even more brightly than you." Outraged and a bit confused because she was the kami of the sun, you know, that thing which is the brightest thing on earth, Amaterasu opened the cave door further, where she was ambushed by a group of gods holding up a mirror, blasting her own radiance back in her face, temporarily blinding Amaterasu, while Taiji Kawa quickly seized her by the wrist and yanked her out of the cave. While she was still frazzled, the other gods set to work fastening sacred ropes around the cave's entrance, forbidding her from ever retreating back inside. And there was great cheering! In fact, the only ones who weren't happy about Amaterasu's return were the sun goddess herself, and Susano, who's practically shitting himself in the corner by this point because he knew his punishment would be coming soon. A council of 800 deities, yes, Izanagi and Izanami shenanigans created that many gods, convened to decide the fate of Susano. And guess who was at the head of it all? Now then, I'm going to end off this video here and continue on with part 3 next time with the punishment of Susano, the giant 8-headed snake, and Tsukiyomi finally doing something. Except, spoiler alert, he actually doesn't. So, when we last left off, Amaterasu was forced out of her intentional confinement by Strong Hand God, and now she's back and can't go back inside. And so it's time for her and the rest of the Japanese pantheon, consisting of roughly 800 kami, to judge her brother Susano for his transgressions against Amaterasu's court and the poor pony he skinned. Oh, and also for unintentionally killing anywhere from like 1 to all of the weaving spirits within Amaterasu's weaving hall. That might have something to do with it too. For his transgressions against his sister, who is basically the chieftain god by this point, Susano was charged with 1,000 tables, which is a lot more literal than you may think. This meant as part of his repentance, Susano would have to pay back 1,000 tables of offerings to Amaterasu. These tables contain such things as clothes, jewels, paper, bronze, and, curiously enough, food. You'll see why in just a second. Anyhow, you all remember back to part 2 when Susano cried so long for Izanami that he grew a beard 8 spans long? Well, as part of his punishment, the gods cut that thing off into something far more manageable. And then, cringe warning by the way, they pulled out his fingernails and toenails, like with a pair of primitive pliers. And then, seemingly because none of this was enough of a punishment already, Susano was disgraced by the court of the kami and expelled from heaven, forced to wander the earth for all eternity. Which, if you think about it, isn't a terrible thing because Susano's whole thing was that he was pretty much just visiting his sister before going off to the underworld anyway. But I guess they dropped that plot point by this point, because this is meant to be a sombering moment in Susano's legacy. Oh no, wait, no, he's still a dick. So this next part actually gets a little bit muddy. It's generally agreed upon that the goddess of food, Ukimochi, was murdered shortly after Susano was expelled from heaven. It's said that a male deity had asked her for some food, and that she responded by producing them some food. Out of her own vomit. This wasn't meant to be a sign of disrespect, that's just how she made food, I guess. However, the male kami took offense to this and murdered her for her transgressions. And out of her corpse came, oh thank Amaterasu, food! Not more goddamn gods, Food! That's not where the confusion comes into play in all this. Let me explain. So in the research I did for this video, just like with parts 1 and 2, my primary sources were the source material, the Kojiki, the original holy text of the Shinto religion, and the Nihongi, the second iteration of the holy text of Japan, but with a lot more Chinese influence. However, I had secondary sources, and a lot of books and websites, including Ukimochi's own Wikipedia page, which I hope to amend sometime in the future, said that Tsukiyomi was the one who killed Ukimochi. Which was a bit odd to me, because both the Nihongi and the Kojiki professed that it was actually Susano who approached the goddess for some food, presumably to fulfill his 1,000-table offerings. And, even more confusing than that, in some of the books that I read, it stated that Tsukiyomi was married to Amaterasu, his sister. This was never mentioned in the Kojiki, by the way. So, I smelled a rat. A big, giant rat with a pen, who went around and started making amendments to these mythological texts. So, I started to follow some of these links. Links which led to some books. Books, for whatever goddamn reason, did not provide citations. Let that all sink in for a moment. Published books did not go through the same efforts that I do for my videos when it comes to credibility. That's a little sad. But at the same time, it could provide you guys a little bit of incentive to go over to my Patreon and help me out over there. You know, shameless plug. Anyhow, I happened by chance at literally the last second. No, I mean like the script was already complete. I sat down and recorded part 2 and I was doing a bit more research on this whole 1,000 tables thing, and I found out the source of this whole Tsukiyomi nonsense in the Handbook of Japanese Mythology by Michael Ashkenazi. Evidently, this widely accepted and popular iteration of the story comes from the Nihon Shoki, written right around 720 AD. This book actually has the honor of being Japan's first real history book, and back in those days, religious doctrine was held in much higher esteem and was actually classified as a part of history. But if you look into who edited this publication, the mystery starts to unravel itself. It turns out that the Imperial Prince Toneri might have exaggerated his lineage a bit. You see, it's widely accepted that the first emperor of Japan, likewise his progeny, were descendants of the sun goddess Amaterasu. In fact, this is the reason Imperial Japan's flag so prominently featured the sun. And quite frankly, this is also the reason that Amaterasu is held in such high esteem by the Japanese people at large. However, Prince Toneri wanted to amend that a little bit. I guess he had a bit of an inferiority complex, only being the descendant of one kami, and so he decided that the royal family should be the descendant of 2 kami. In fact, hell with it, let's just make them the 2 most prominent and important kami in the whole friggin' pantheon. And thus Amaterasu and Tsukiyomi were written to be an incestuous pair. However, probably realizing that people may become suspicious as to why the Kojiki and Nihongi never made mention to this fact before, Toneri came up with the brilliant idea to write Tsukiyomi as being the one who killed Ukimochi, and is the reason why the 2 divorced. But then people said, "Nah, that's not true, bro. It quite literally says right here that Susano did it." But proud Prince Toneri thought of that too and said,
"No, it's totally true. Why else do you think that the sun and the moon are never in the sky at the same time? It's 'cause my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother filed a restraining order against my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, yo."
Well, looks like they patched things up.
Hey, correction, dumbass. The Nihon Shoki and the Nihongi are the exact same book. Yeah, this is a pretty amateur mistake of mine. I stand by all of my faults with this one. But at the same time, I still do stand by my theory that Prince Toneri was trying to cook the books as far as his ancestry. Okay? Alright, cool. Moving on. Anyhow, since this is the mythology channel and not the suck-off Horihito channel, guess where this thing goes? So in the actual story, Susano flees the scene of the crime and is evidently never caught because there is no further ramifications imposed on him by the court of the gods. Lucky him. But from the body of Ukimochi came all sorts of seeds for rice, millet, barley, and beans, which Susano cast off into the wind because, you know, he's the god of storms and such. And now the humans have food. Cool, Susano actually did something good for once. And his road to redemption doesn't end there. On Earth, Susano came across the Hi River in a land known as Idzumo. Down the river, he noticed a pair of chopsticks floating down the water, and so he headed upstream to investigate. There he found an old man, his wife, and a young girl between them, and they were all weeping uncontrollably. The old man introduced himself as the son of the great mountain possessor deity, and he was known as the foot-stroking deity. This man's job was to rub the other gods' feet. Oh, what an honorific title. Basically, these guys weren't really even gods by this point, more or less they were actual humans. He introduces his wife, the earthly hand-stroking deity, and their daughter, Princess Inada. Susano then asks the family why they are crying so much. I mean, you could probably ascertain why the foot-rubbing deity was crying, but I guess he was more or less asking about his wife and daughter. The old man tells him that he and his wife had originally had 8 daughters, yet one day the 8-forked serpent of Koshi came to their land and devoured one of their daughters, and then came back, year after year, devouring one of the daughters again and again, one for each one of its serpentine heads. Until now, on the 8th year, the foot-rubbing old man would have to feed his final daughter to the last head of the giant serpents. Susano took an interest of this beast, and so offered to slay the serpent of Koshi in exchange for Inada's hand in marriage. Eventually, the old foot-rubber forked over his daughter to Susano, who turned her into a comb and stuck her in his hair for safekeeping, and agreed to fight the 8-headed serpents, which, by the way, also had 8 gigantic tails and was said to be so long that he spanned 8 mountains and 8 valleys. So even Susano recognized that he was going to need some help. And the brilliant god did come up with a plan, which was for the 2 elders to make a really big shelf, and on each of these shelves lay out a big-ass vat of their strongest liquor. Somehow, these 2 decrepit old senior citizens managed to pull this off just in time for the serpent's arrival for Inada, who then proceeded to do literally the worst thing ever and decided to drink on an empty stomach, swallowing down the tubs of liquor like shot glasses. The snake then passed out in a drunken stupor just like my dad, and Susano whipped out a 10-span sword and started chopping the snake to bits, and turning the Hi River into a river of blood. Edgy, I know. As Susano was finishing up, he tried to cut off the middle tail of the snake when all of a sudden his sword broke in half. Thinking this was odd, Susano sliced open the tail with the point of his sword to reveal another sword. However, this sword was divine. And this whole experience somehow turned out to be a moment of character development for Susano. And so he gave over the sword he dubbed Herb Quelling Great Sword, or Grass Cutter if you want to be American, to the gods in the heaven as a sort of no hard feelings gift, before setting off for the land of Suga, where he proclaimed his heart was pure. And there he married Inada, built a palace in his own honor, and upgraded his father-in-law from the foot-rubbing deity to the look-after-my-palace deity. What a guy! Anyhow, that is the end of the Japanese creation story. Granted, I probably could have stopped this video series right around part 1, but meh. Thank you all so much for watching, but before you go, why not subscribe to the channel for future updates and join my Discord to discuss all things mythology. Got a request for a future video? Leave it in the comments section below and I might just get to it in the future. Until next time though, my name is Messiahs and Mythologies, and I'll see you all later.
Deserve to die.